Good morning, everybody. This is Jim Ransom with another edition of Morning Jim Poetry Readings from my not very imposing studio. I'm actually at the table in my kitchen in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, where the north wind has finally decided to blow and winter is on the table. I haven't tried to be very academic in my poetry selections or reading style. I hope you would agree with me on that. Academism, and as I said in my book several years ago, has almost killed poetry. But still, questions arise about the structure of poems, and I had some this last week, so they deserve answers, such as, do poems have to rhyme? Well, the answer is no, they don't. And you may recall that I mentioned this when we were reading cowboy poetry several weeks ago, that the cowboy poets had gotten into a big tiff among themselves about whether cowboy poems should rhyme, because there were some more recent cowboy poets that came on board, and they didn't write rhyming poetry. Some of them became pretty popular, and that was resented by some of the mainline cowboy poets. But anyway, they worked it out, and now they accept non-rhyming poetry. Oddly enough, a lot of the poets who wrote non-rhyming poetry were the female cowboy poets. And there are plenty of women who are skilled cowboys who can lasso a calf and apply a branding iron. They're real. They're the real thing. And so the cowboy poets decided that it was okay if they wanted to write non-rhyming poems. They weren't going to fight that too much. It was probably echoes of Lysistrata that entered their brains at that time. But anyway, we have to ask ourselves how far back non-rhyming poetry goes. Well, Walt Whitman didn't write rhyming poetry. And we can even go back to the days of Shakespeare, when the sonnets were usually beautifully rhyming poems, but the plays that he wrote were not rhyming. They were written, however, in iambic pentameter. Whoa, let's not get too academic here. What is an iamb or an iambic? It's like a heartbeat. Put your finger on your wrist and you can sort of feel your heart beating. If you can't, call 911 with all the strength you have left. But anyway, you'll notice that your pulse goes to verbalize it. It goes ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. And that's like one stressed and one unstressed syllable, and an iambic pentameter, which means 5 words or 5 iambs per line, is made up of iambic and 5. So it's an iambic pentameter. That's all. That's as academic as we're going to get here today. That works in English and some other Western European languages, and though not in ancient Hebrew. So the Psalms that we all were brought up with, at least in my age group, they were never written or translated in iambics. Psalms were written in a certain number of word units, like 2 or 3 complex Hebrew words per line. So when it came to translating those into English, they tried to get the meaning, and they didn't try to recreate familiar poetic rhythms familiar to English in order to do it. But think about the 23rd Psalm, which many of us probably had to memorize when we were in Bible school. It's a beautiful poem, but it doesn't depend on Iambic Pentameter to be beautiful. It was beautiful because of the word choices of the original Hebrew authors. Okay, now I'm going to quit giving a lecture on poetic structure. I never really wanted to do that. How did that happen? I don't know, but I thought it might add to your enjoyment of the poetry that we do have and are more familiar with. So here's one of the best and most famous poems in American literature, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Well, that's certainly a beautiful poem. I think we're all familiar with it. And it is in iambic pentameter plus rhyming, rhyming couplets in this case. Now, there is, though, a little twinge that takes it out of the main path of poetry, and it comes in at the end. And let me read you the last 2 stanzas again. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. Now, in the last stanza, he picks up the word sweep and rhymes it over and over again to bring the poem to an end. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now, this is a deliberate concept, a deliberate mechanism to get us to focus on some other things besides the woods themselves and the horse. He wants us to think about our lives. He wants to think about his life in the poem, the speaker. I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And there's 2 pretty obvious ideas there. And miles to go before I sleep. And he's talking about his present situation. He's got to go several miles with the horse and the sleigh before he can go home and sleep. But then he says, and miles to go before I sleep. So what is he thinking? What does he want us to think about with that? Well, he wants us to go forward in our lives till the last final sleep, which is passing out of this world and into the next. So, in this little poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, Robert Frost has packed a powerful lot of ideas and expresses them with such beauty. You can hardly ever get enough of it. But now let's move back to the time when Shakespeare was writing in Iambic Pentameter. And he was doing it to make it easier for his actors to memorize the lines. Because remember, the plays are rather long, and they depend entirely on, well, not entirely. The actors had costumes on. And if there was a sword fight, they had swords, and they were fighting with them on stage. But it was mostly linguistic tricks that made the poems work and made them easy to memorize. And one of them was the Iambic Pentameter. It's much easier to memorize something that has a regular rhythm to it. So let's try this speech from Julius Caesar by Marc Antony. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Now, the reason that first line is sort of split up and loud is that in the actual play, the mob has been listening to a speech by Brutus, Cassius Brutus, who is telling them why Caesar had to be killed. And Caesar had to be killed because he was going to make himself king. And this was the Roman Republic here. And the Republic was, it had some problems of its own, but the Republican senators certainly didn't want to lose their jobs, did they? And they didn't want to become subordinate to an emperor, which, of course, they did later anyway. But here we are at the death of Julius Caesar and at the funeral. So Marc Antony says, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men, come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious. And Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious. And Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented Caesar with a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious. And sure, he is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. You all did love Caesar once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. Okay, now there's a little more to that, but I think the point that I'm trying to make is that Caesar could write a speech in which he made Caesar, Shakespeare could write a speech in which he made Caesar sound like the enemy of the people. And then he came back and wrote a speech for Marc Antony, which completely turned the crowd's emotions back to sympathy with Caesar. And if you're watching this play, you can see the crowd look at each other, and they're beginning to see, uh-oh, we were wrong. And they're beginning to mumble and groan. And Brutus and his co-conspirators are beginning to put themselves out of sight at the back of the crowd. And that is Iambic Pentameter. It's a powerful method without any rhyme of expressing and giving the feeling to the speech of the actors. In my own poetry, I frequently use rhyme, but more often in recent poems I do not. Sometimes I will write what I call a pseudo-sonnet in iambs, but rhyme only the last two lines. That seems to tie things together better than no rhyme at all. I hope that gives you some idea of why poetry can still be poetry and rhyme and without rhyme, and poetry can still be poetry and rhyme. But we have to be careful in this day and age that the rhymes are carefully constructed and not sort of da-da-dee-da-da-dee-da, and not kind of artificial rhymes. Probably the best rhyming poet of our time has been Dr. Seuss. And his verses were written for children, but not really. When we all read them to our children, we got many messages from them ourselves. Well, folks, hope this was fun for you. I enjoyed reading these great poems, and I hope to see you next Saturday when the program will be completely different, but I'm not saying what it's going to be. I've had enough of that. It locks me in too much. Bye now.